There's so much anxiousness in our world today. People have feelings of anxiety that in many ways they feel overwhelmed by. And with all of this anxiousness that we're feeling in our lives, it is good for us to try and to be careful and to love one another. And at the same time, we must remind ourselves constantly, especially in the times in which we're living right now, to not be overwhelmed by fear and to rely more on the direction and guidance of our God. You see, Jesus still speaks to us down through the centuries in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, where he says, do not be anxious about your life. He says, look at the birds of the air. God takes care of them, and are you not of more value than them? And instead, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And therefore, don't be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious enough for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. You ever felt that way? That each day has enough trouble of its own for us to be worrying about tomorrow. Those are wise words from Jesus. I think human nature really is that we have a tendency to be anxious and we have a tendency to be fearful. And I think the primary reason is because we're living in a fallen world with viruses and with health conditions and problems and strife and hatefulness in our world. And so naturally, human beings, because they are separated from their creator and their, all of these issues in our lives that we're dealing with, we have a tendency to feel anxious and to feel fearful. And so we need somebody, and the biblical picture is that God sends someone into our lives, into our worldview, who removes fear and who rids us of our suffering and who's going to wipe away all of our tears and unite all people and remove poverty and create peace and justice and heal diseases and, in fact, eventually kill off death itself. Man, we need that more than ever. The Bible has the two words, fear not, written in its pages 365 times in most translations of the Bible. And I heard a preacher one time say that, there's a promise of fear not for each day of our lives if we would just read them. And yet instead of focusing in on the words fear not, we live each day thinking and worrying about how awful things may end up being. And it's good for us to be careful. In fact, churches right now everywhere are struggling with wisdom. How can we best, serve our people and care for our people? But for most of us, with our everyday concerns and worries, we end up listening to our hearts rather than talking to our hearts and telling our hearts what to think and how to feel. Sometimes our fears are very, very specific. Some people are afraid of crowds. Some people are afraid of being lonely. Some people are afraid of failing. Other people are afraid of actually succeeding. Some people are afraid of change. And there are some people who, believe it or not, they can't stand it when things don't change. For a lot of people, they have an ongoing struggle. And for some of them, it may be biochemical. For some of them, it may be life circumstances. But for whatever reason, they have an ongoing struggle with depression and with anxiousness. And it may even manifest itself sometimes in things like panic attacks. Soren Kierkegaard believed that the source of all anxiousness in life was a sense of dread that we just had underneath the surface. There was this sense of dread that was prevalent in our lives, and it makes life difficult to cope with. It's like a dark cloud that just hangs over us at all times. Jean-Paul Sartre believed that all worry stems from our past and how our parents or other parental figures failed us. Karl Marx believed that worry stemmed from how things are going to turn out in the future and how our neighbors often are the ones who fail us. Kierkegaard believed a lot of our worry came actually from our concerns about eternity and about our relationship with God. Jesus speaks to us in the text and he says, take one day at a time. And there's a word that Jesus uses to talk about anxiety or worry, and it really has to do with concerns that become unhealthy and unproductive, where you allow certain events or circumstances to overwhelm you and to fuel your fear. And it's in the midst of life when that's our feeling. The Bible does does not tell us to look at our worry and to simply say, just get tougher. Just get over it. The Bible never says that. And on the other hand, in the words of the very famous 80s song that said, don't worry, be happy, the Bible also doesn't say just sweep your worry under the rug and forget about it. The Bible actually gives us some direction on how to handle worry and how to handle anxiousness in our everyday lives. And I think we need this message now more than maybe we've ever needed it. Peter talks about it in 1 Peter chapter 5, and I want to just pause here and I want to ask, who is Peter to be able to tell us in our modern age about worry? I mean, Peter didn't have to navigate the health and life of a church the way that we do now, right? Well, of course, I'm being facetious. The truth is, Peter knew all about fear, and he knew all about anxiety. They were living in a time, Peter and his followers, and all followers of Jesus, really, they were living in a time in first century Rome where they, as Christians, were seen as a nuisance. Nobody wanted them in their society. In fact, they were outcasts. And in fact, they were being taken, Christians were, because of their profession of faith in Jesus as Lord rather than Caesar as Lord. They were being taken and put into the Roman Colosseum, as an example. And they were being placed in the middle of the Colosseum and fed to lions and other wild beasts. Some of them were thrown out there to do battle as, pure novices against seasoned gladiators. And they were killed for sport. And they lived with the reality of suffering and the constant dread of it. So for them, and as Peter writes what we're about to read, this idea of anxiousness or worry, it's not a theory. They lived through it. They could endure severe violence at any moment. They had plenty of reasons to give in to worry. I think in our modern age, we think we're very, very different from them. But Peter's writing to people in his time who are also very normal people who worried about things like, are we going to have enough money? How are we going to care for our family? What's the future hold? How are we going to clothe and food the people we love the most? And so at the outset, just establishing context, Peter can identify with us, and probably more so than we realize. And I think it's important for us to understand that Peter actually heard what Jesus had to say firsthand as he spoke it in Matthew 6 about anxiousness. So in 1 Peter chapter 5, I want us to hone in this morning on two verses 6 and 7, where it says, "Humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you." I want to highlight three things here. This is how we should navigate worry and anxiety in our present age, but it requires some effort on our parts. First thing is the instruction to humble ourselves. And so here is Peter, verse 6. "Humble yourselves, therefore," and here is the context of humbling yourselves, "under the mighty hand of God." At the very outset of thinking about this particular subject matter of our everyday struggle, we are reminded that God is sovereign. Peter is saying, above all other things, that at the foundation of how we are to live our lives, we must live our lives with this understanding that our God is sovereign. Humble yourselves, he says, under the mighty hand of God. And Jesus echoes this. He talks about the sovereignty and control of God. And in Matthew 6, verse 34, having established that God is in control over all things, even down to small things like the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, Jesus then says, therefore, based on the sovereignty of God, therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow. And so a lot of times our anxiety is over the things that are potential. But we must remember that there is one who is in control of all potentials. We're anxious because we don't think we have the right amount of control over certain things. And Jesus highlights this in Matthew 6:27. He says we have a problem with control. He says, who of you by worrying can actually add a single hour to his life? That's the whole point. You can't. You can't add any time to your life by worrying. You're not in control. See, we want control, but God's actually the one in control. And Jesus is trying to remind us of that by saying, who's been caring for your life all of these years? Here's the reality. You're not going to like it, and I won't either. But the reality is, you've always been out of control. You've always been vulnerable. Only God is the one who is actually sovereign and in ultimate control. And so Peter says, humble. The very first thing you should do when you think about worry, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. And he says, humble yourselves. And here's the second thing, casting your anxieties on him. And here's how he phrases it. Verse 7. Casting all your anxieties on him. And here's the reasoning for that. Because he cares for you. That's awesome. The word here for casting is it's an active participle. And the word here really is not just to cast something or to throw something at someone, but it really carries with it the ing flavor to the word. So it's casting. It's an ongoing thing. Periopsantes. It means to continually cast, or you're in the process of casting your cares and your anxieties and your worries all the time on the person of God. And so that requires a mental effort on our part, that yes, we become overwhelmed with worry, and it's in those moments we have to think about casting our anxieties on the sovereignty and care of God, because he cares about us. And so a lot of times when we feel overburdened, Peter says, humble yourselves, casting your cares on him. So if you think about it, we're really down to two options in life. Something is either up to me or it's up to God. And we think we're a lot of times on our own in life, and that we need to learn to handle things by ourselves. But here's a news flash. The biblical worldview is that you were never created to handle life by yourself. And so Peter is saying, you are to humble yourself, casting your anxieties upon him. I'll never forget the first time I took a flight anywhere. We took an airplane ride to Texas, or really to California by way of Texas. We had a layover in Houston from Nashville, and I am terrified of flying. I have a deep fear of flying, and the experience of flying did nothing to calm my fears. And I can just remember being on the plane and just thinking, after I'd been up in the air, which to me, the landing and the taking off part are by far and away the worst things, because you're very anxious about those moments, whether they will be successful. But I remember after being in the air for about an hour, just thinking to myself, what is the pilot doing? We have not heard from the pilot in a long time. And I just thought of, what could I do? How could I learn about, what the pilot, is the pilot still awake? Is he still even alive? And I remember the flight attendant coming by, she was, asking if people wanted, I don't know, what peanuts or whatever. And I just asked her, can you tell me where we are right now? We seem to be flying over a stretch of land. I can't really tell where we are. And she said, well, I'm not real sure right now. And I, in my mind, I'm thinking, I've got to figure out if the pilot's alive. So I say to her, can you ask the pilot where we are? Thinking, she can go and she'll report back and discover, if anything's wrong with the pilot. But it's kind of a humorous thing to think about. Even if she went into the front of the cabin and discovered that there was something wrong with the pilot, what was I going to do about it? I mean, and I'm in, the sixth row, the third seat, with absolutely zero control over the trajectory of this multi-ton metal aircraft suspended thousands of feet in the air. It's kind of comical if you think about it. And so we must cast our anxieties upon the ultimate pilot, because he is sovereign and he does have control, and there's nothing wrong with him at all. And that has to be our confidence. Our confidence has to be in our pilot. Philippians 1:6, I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ. And so we can get weighed down by changes in our circumstances. Peter says, humble yourselves, casting all your anxiety upon God because he cares for you. And that's really our third thing, the reasoning behind it all. The reason we humble ourselves under God's control and sovereignty, and the reason we are in this process daily of casting our anxieties upon God is because of that third idea, that he cares for you. That's really a humbling thing to think about. Phillips' translation translates verse 7 this way, where he says, you can throw the whole weight of your anxieties upon him. Now watch how he translates this. For you are his personal concern. You ever thought about yourself that way? That you are God's personal concern. You see, if God doesn't worry about anything because God's in control, but if he were to worry about something, he would actually worry about you because you are of such value to him. And remember, that's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 26, when he says, look, consider it. Look at the birds of the air. Think about them. God feeds them. Are you not of more value in God's heart than them? See, God is good. And there are times where we may not understand our circumstances. We don't know what God's doing, both for our good and for eternity, from one circumstance to another. But we do know this. We are his personal concern. You are his personal concern. And that he cares about you. One of my favorite illustrations, Brother Marlon Connolly brought this to light in a sermon many years ago, where he talked about Rembrandt's painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. What's really interesting about the particular painting, which depicts Jesus and his disciples on the fishing boat, and they're out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and the storm is assailing the boat and about to capsize it. And you know how the story goes, where Jesus is asleep and the disciples ask him, don't you care that we're perishing? Like petulant children, they're worried. What's really interesting about Rembrandt's depiction of this is that there are actually 14 people in the boat. And if you stop and think about it, there are 12 disciples and Jesus makes 13. But in Rembrandt's painting, there are 14 people in the boat. And what's really interesting about it is Rembrandt painted his own portrait on the shoulders of the 14th man. And that was his way of saying we're all sort of in the boat, in the storm, on the sea of life. And Jesus is always at the helm, doing hundreds of things behind the scenes of our life, plotting for our joy, and we don't even know it. Are you fighting a battle in secret? Are you anxious? I want to say to you, look outside yourself. Your God is in the middle of it. And rejoice during your circumstances. Because in this, God is working for your ultimate good. And if you ever doubt that God cares for you, look at the cross. See, God is standing somewhere close by your life at every moment, watching you. And if you'll but look, you'll find the person of Jesus present with you, always, even to the end of your life. He knows about your struggles, and he cares. You are his personal concern.
In Jesus' name, his love is burning in our hearts like living flame. For through the loving Son, the Father makes us one. Come take the bread, come drink the wine, come share the Lord. No one is a stranger here. Everyone belongs. joins us here. He breaks the bread.